I'm Lossien, and today we're going to turn all of this into this. The next step is to sew everything together so we can try it on. Now, normally this would actually be out of your mock-up fabric to make sure that the pattern works before you cut it out of your actual good fabric. Because I've done a lot of pattern making in my time, I just use my actual fabric because I know I will have to take it in and I'll always have enough fabric. So, what I like to start with is the skirt. You can see the fabric's very slippery, not always easy to work with. And I started by sewing down the two sides of the selvage edge, which created 4 pieces in total of the skirt instead of 6. So all I did was run a very long basting stitch down the selvage edge of those 2 panels. Now a basting stitch is like a length 4 or 5 of a stitch, so that it's easy to rip apart afterwards to make sure that you can take it apart easily. Now to sew all the skirt panels together. The skirt panels with the seam running down them will actually be the 2 side skirt panels, and then the folded ones become the front and back. Because this is a wrap dress, what that actually ends up being is sewing a folded skirt panel to a seamed skirt panel, and so on and so forth, so that it goes seam, folded, as you wrap around the body. As a note, when I say folded, that just means the pattern when you cut it was folded. You will actually want to unfold it and sew down that length measurement. We definitely don't want to sew it as it is still folded. Then we put the skirt aside. We lay the back piece of the bodice out flat and line up our front piece so that the shoulder seam and side seam matches. That means the wrap goes out towards the other side. You're going to sew on one side along that shoulder seam and along that side seam from underarm to waist. Then place the other piece on top on the other side and connect it down so that both your front pieces are on top of the back piece. And sew them at the shoulder and the side seam again. Now we set aside the rest of the bodice and grab out the sleeve. The trick here is to take a moment and put a notch in the very center of the hem of the sleeve and at the center of the cuff. This way we know exactly where to line them up. Fold the cuff in half and then gently hand gather the hem of the sleeve into the cuff, making sure that the sides line up and the middle lines up. When we actually sew this, we're going to be putting a basting stitch and gathering it in. Before the mock-up, it's just as easy to make little hand pleats with your fingers just to get an idea that the volume is enough for what you want it to look like. Then, fold the sleeve in half so that the cuff touches itself and sew all the way up to the underarm. I like to do just one sleeve on the mock-ups. It makes it easier, and if there's any changes, so there's less that you have to change. When you're doing this, you want to line up your sleeve inside the armhole of your actual front and back bodice that you already sewed together. To do this, I take that top notch and pin it to the shoulder seam. Then I take the bottom seam of the sleeve where the underarm is and pin that to the top of the side seam that we did on the bodice. So this means that you actually have it all attached, but there is too much fabric in there on the sleeve because we're going to gather the very top. So, from that bottom underarm point, we sew it 2/3 of the way up on either side flat and then hand gather the very top third on both sides. I took a quick moment to notch the center back on the bodice piece so that I had it to line up to the skirt. So that center notch actually lines up with the center of one of the folded panels on the skirt, the second panel in. Then, the next step is to line up the side seams of the bodice with the sewn panels of the skirt. So the part of the skirt that you want is to either side of that folded panel, you have the sewn panels with the selvage edge. That selvage edge that's sewn is what you pin to the bodice side seam. Now you actually want to also attach the sewn part of the actual panels, like one panel to the next. This lines up with about 1/4 of the bodice outwards from the side seam. It sounds really complicated, hopefully these diagrams help. And along the front, you just go 3/4 across. Then we're gonna hand gather everything in because the skirt's gonna be twice the size of the actual bodice. But having these pins really helps keep everything together so you know where everything should sit. Then simply baste the bodice and skirt together. Then when we're trying it on, it's good to remember that it is right over left and we want all the seams on the outside. The very first thing that I realized was that it was way too big at the waist. I ended up taking it in 1 inch on either side and had to take it in at the armpit as well because it was just too baggy to go under the vest. I just use straight pins here to make sure everything looks the way I want it to, and we'll mark it after. Then I realized that it was actually too long in the waist as well. So I pinned it up at the back, making sure it was sitting at my actual waist, and trying to take mostly from the actual bodice and not as much from the skirt. Then I had to pin it at the front as well because, once again, it was too long. I made a quick note of where it wanted to tie to the side seam because I found that the piece that went across dropped a bit as it went over. Then I realized that the front neck piece was too short for what her actual front neck piece was, so I took a measurement quickly with my hand to see how much I would have to extend it to make it lay properly. And then it was time to take everything apart again. I seam ripped the sleeve off, taking my time to make sure I didn't wreck the fabric, and took the cuff off as well. Because everything fit, there was no adjustments to be made there. The next step was to actually measure out the amount that I had pinned up on the bodice so that I knew exactly how much I had to take the bodice pieces up. I measured all the way across so that I knew the approximate for the back and the front. Then I unpinned it and seam ripped the skirt away from the bodice. I wanted to make sure that everything that was pinned was going to be taken out of the bodice itself because I don't want to shorten the skirt part at all. Then I undid the side seams, making sure to take that measurement as well, and laid out the bodice so that the center back was folded and the fronts laid on top of each other. I measured up the amount, the median between the two sides, left and right, and drew a line all the way across the bodice on the bottom and cut that off so I had my new bodice waist seam. For the neck piece, I took a double piece of fabric and laid it down, and then I took my existing bodice piece and laid it on top of that piece so that I could trace all the way from the center back neck down around the neckline and all the way to where it attached to the side seam there. I drew in from that line a seam allowance amount, and then from that initial line I drew out the amount I wanted to extend it and up as well the amount that I wanted to extend it. Then I cut that piece out with seam allowance on every single side and lay that on top of a new piece of fabric to cut it out a second time. So in the end I had 4 pieces of this new pattern piece. Going to sew are going to end up being French seams. Now this means that every seam is going to be sewn twice. We're going to start wrong sides together, sewing it at about 1/4 inch. Then we're going to trim the seam allowance so it's only 1/8 inch, flip your whole piece of fabric, your garment, the other way around so it's right sides together, and re-sew that seam at 1/4 inch again, which means that your 1/8 seam allowance is trapped inside that new seam, and we don't have any bits of fraying fabric anywhere. Now, as you can see, I started with the side seams on the bodice, making sure to take in the amount that I had pinned. Then, I trimmed my seam allowance and flipped all my fabric the other way and sewed the side seams again. You can also see that I sewed the shoulder seams while I was at it, right sides together, flip it all the other way, and sew it again. You can also see that I take a moment when I flipped it for the second time to really make sure that that seam is pressed out with my fingers. We don't have any extra folds of fabric there. That extra neck piece that we cut, or the facing as it were, is the next piece we're going to sew. I made sure I had 2 in a pile, and then I sewed along the inside neck and down the front. Now on this piece that was towards the right, you can see I did that on both pieces. Because my fabric is the same side to side, I didn't have to worry about left and right. I also then clipped the corner of the seam so that I could turn it right side out eventually, and clipped around the collar so that that curved seam could also be turned outside right. Then once that was done, I did the other one so that both pieces were sewn together. I clipped all my corner and my curve. Then I laid it out right side up and put the other piece right side down on top, making sure both were open, and sewed along that back neck seam. This made those two facing pieces into one long piece. I opened up that seam I had just sewn and lined it up good side to the good side of the center back neck of the actual shirt we have sewn before. Then I sewed along that inside neck all the way to where the center front mark was, and then down all the way to the side seam. Once that was done, I went back to the center back neck and sewed down the other side of the facing all the way to the collar, to the center front, and then down all the way to the side seam. This sounds pretty complicated, but it just meant that the facing was attached all the way around from the side seam up to the center front, around the back collar, and back down the center front to the other side seam. And this was only on half of the facing. The other half, if you folded it right side out, would lay on top of that. To finish off the neck facing, the next step requires us going over to the iron and prepping and pinning everything. So if you lay your shirt out properly and then fold your facing so that the wrong sides are together, so your right side is on the outside both ways, starting at the center back, you'll then want to fold under that extra seam allowance on your extra piece of facing and pin it. Now, we're going to pin it from the other side that you're not seeing here, so that we can do what's called a stitch in the ditch. A stitch in the ditch means that you're stitching right where your seam was, where you attached your facing to your bodice earlier. So that means when you fold over the fabric on this side, you want to go just past that stitching that you can see, pushing all the seam allowance from that seam up and into the collar so it's hidden away. You can see me also pressing the edge of the collar that we have already sewn of the two facings together, just to make that nice and crisp. And then all you do is take your time going along that inside seam where we have that raw edge of fabric and folding it under so that it's just past that previously stitched edge. Then you're going to pin from the other side where we can see the seam, making sure to catch that bit of facing so that we know when we sew it, it'll all be self-contained. Now, sitting down looking at the right side of the garment, what we're going to do is called stitching in the ditch. We're going to stitch all the way along that facing, taking out the pins before we sew over them, and making sure that we're stitching directly on top of that seam we stitched before. This makes the sewing almost invisible, and because we folded the extra facing just a little bit past that seams, it means that we catch the fabric on the other side as well. So in the end, we have a very nice, clean looking seam. We start down at the side seam, go all the way up, around the neck, and down towards the other side seam, doing the whole thing. Just take your time and really get it as close to that seam as possible, because the more directly you are on that seam, the more invisible the stitching will be. And now we move on to the sleeves. To start, we're going to fold one sleeve in half, wrong side to wrong side, so that the top bell part is folded in half. Then we're going to stitch it at about 1/4 of an inch, which is half of our seam allowance amount, and sew all the way down. Then, because we want this to be a French seam, just like all our other seams on the rest of the garment, we're going to trim the seam allowance so it's about 1/8 of an inch, flip the whole piece so that it's good side to good side, and sew that seam again, trapping all the seam allowance in this new seam. This way we have a finished sleeve piece. We just have to deal with the top and the bottom of the sleeve now. We're going to repeat that on the second sleeve, and then we'll get started on the rest of the sleeve. The next thing we're going to do is some basting. Basting is a nice long stitch, usually a length of 4 or 5, that we can then pull one string of and get a nice even gather. So I notched about half of the way down the bell on each side, and I made a nice long basting stitch from that notch on one side over the top of the bell to that halfway point on the other side. Now, when you're basting, you actually want to leave your threads nice and long. This gives you something to actually hold on to when you're making those gathers. I also basted along all the bottom edge where we're going to be putting our cuff. So starting at the side seam, going all the way around to the other side seam, but not stitching on top of itself. I did this for the other sleeve as well, so that we could then attach the cuff. I took the cuff and folded it in half, good side to good side, so the forearm measurement, or the width, was folded in half. I stitched down the seam allowance amount because we're going to be folding this in half lengthwise, so we don't actually see the inside of this seam and we don't have to worry about making it a French seam. I repeated it for the second cuff as well. With that cuff still folded, I took a moment and just made a little notch on the halfway mark on the other side, so I knew exactly where that halfway mark was. I did the same on the sleeve, making sure I didn't clip the actual basting stitch that we did. Then, I flipped my cuff right side out and lined up that center seam on the inside, which right side in, of the sleeve and pinned them together. I moved the other side of the cuff where the notch was to match up with the notch on the inside of the sleeve. Now at this point you'll notice that the sleeve is way bigger than the cuff that we just pinned onto it. That's okay, because the next step is to grab that long basting thread and start pulling the fabric all the way so that it bunches up or gathers. We're going to continue to gently pull on that basting stitch, working all the gathers to the side, as you can see I'm doing with my fingers, until the sleeve matches up to the cuff inside, so they're the same length. Then pin, and you can wrap the thread around the pin to make sure it stops moving. And you're going to grab that basting thread from the other half of the sleeve and do the same thing. To sew all the gathers to the cuff, I flip everything the other way around so the gather's on the inside and the cuff is on the outside. Then I lay it down on my machine and start on the bottom and sew all the way around, taking my time to make sure that the gathers look nice and pretty. This means making sure that all the stuff, the seam allowance going up is facing up and all the extra fabric going down is facing down. Sometimes it can flip a little over that gathering line and we don't want that, so take your time. And also try to stitch on top of that basting line as much as you can, starting from that seam all the way around and just over the seam again, and that will attach your cuff on one side. Then we're going to pull everything so that you can see all the good sides, trim in extra threads, and see how nice your cuff looks, but your cuff's way too long at this point. We fold the cuff wrong side to wrong side together in half so that all that extra seam allowance goes past that seam we just sewed, but on the inside. We're going to tuck all the seam allowance from that seam towards the rest of the cuff, and then we're going to fold the edge of that inside cuff so that it is just past the seam we just sewed, but all that seam allowance is tucked on the inside. Then we're going to stitch in the ditch, much like we did for the collar, so that all the seam allowance is caught inside and we have that cuff that we wanted. Make sure that you're catching that piece that was folded over underneath so that the cuff actually stays where you want it to. This is a great time to pause for a moment. You need. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other sleeve. So of course we're going to notch the halfway point on our actual cuff, then we're going to pin our cuff to the sleeve hem and gather that basting so that it equals the amount that the sleeve is. This always takes some time and a lot of pins to make sure it's equaled out. Then we're going to stitch that all the way around so the gather is attached. Then we're going to flip out the cuff and fold all that in on itself at that halfway mark again, and fold it along that seam we just sewed and stitch in the ditch, attaching the underside of that cuff to that seam so that we don't see any of the stitching, but we have that nice finished cuff, and all our extra seam allowance and little bits of fabric are tucked away so we don't see them and they're not going to fray around on us. And now it's time to sew the sleeve into the bodice. So the first thing to do is to match up the wrong sides together. Now, normally we would sew right sides together so it all looks pretty when you flip it the other way, but we're actually going to be sewing the seam twice so that the seam is contained inside itself in what is called a French seam. So the first thing I'm going to do is match up that very center top notch with the center shoulder seam of the actual bodice and put a pin in that. Then I'm going to match the bottom seam of the sleeve with the bottom of the armhole and pin that together. From that bottom pin, at the bottom of the armhole, I go up one side, smoothing the fabric of the armhole and the sleeve together until I reach the point where the basting starts on the actual sleeve. I'm going to put a pin there and then do the same on the opposite side of the sleeve, again from the bottom all the way up the back, and pin it where the basting starts. Now all that's left is to take that basting and gather one side of it with your hand, pulling the bobbin thread if that's your choice, or the top thread, whichever one feels more comfortable to you, and continuing to pull until that pin from the very top of the armhole down to that pin where the basting starts equals the same amount as the armhole itself on the bodice. Then you do the same on the back until everything is gathered on the sleeve and the sleeve is now the same length all the way around as the armhole that you're pinning it to. Then you're going to sew it all together all the way around. And I always take a moment when I finish a seam to trim all the threads. The next step is actually trimming all that seam allowance that we just sewed down so that it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam we just sewed. We're making it super tiny, being very careful not to cut the actual stitching line, but getting that seam allowance nice and close so there's not too much extra fabric. Now flip the dress the other way around so all the good sides are together. And then we're going to sew that seam again because you'll see that the seam allowance that we just trimmed is trapped inside the seam. And we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch in from that seam we just sewed, which means that the 1/8 seam allowance is trapped inside this new seam. Now to clarify, this means that the good side is facing the good side, and that we're looking at the wrong side on both sides of the fabric if we were to look at it. That way when we open this seam at the end, we have all the good side looking nice and pretty, and all the seam allowance will then be trapped on the inside and we won't see it. It's very similar to how we did the bodice seams, the side seams and the shoulder seams. It's just that this is the armhole, so it's curved around. And then we're just going to repeat that whole process on the other sleeve. And with the bodice mostly done, we're going to switch our focus to the skirt. Now initially when we made our mock-up, we sewed the skirt panels together, wrong side to wrong side. We're going to sew all of those seams again with a normal stitch instead of a basting stitch, wrong side to wrong side. Every single seam, just as when we did the mock-up. And we're going to trim all of our seam allowance all the way up so that it's only 1/8 of an inch, so we can turn these seams into French seams. So repeat that for every single seam, and it is very time consuming. To turn these into French seams, what we're going to do is take the fabric and open it, and then fold it so you have wrong side to wrong side, so that that seam we just trimmed is inside the fabric now. You want to make sure that that seam is nice and flat and there's no extra fabric caught in it, and we're going to stitch it all the way down at 1/4 of an inch. That means that the 1/8 seam allowance is trapped inside there and we aren't going to see it. Then we're going to do that for every single seam. So you're sewing every skirt seam twice. Take your time, really make sure that that seam is as flat as possible and you're not catching any extra fabric that you don't want. You can definitely take your skirt to the iron first, open your seams and iron them, then fold it right side to right side and iron it again so that seam is nice and flat. It's whatever you're comfortable doing and what's going to make this easier for you to make the skirt. Also going to take a moment and do a double fold edge on the very edge of both sides of the skirt. This means that when you're looking at all the seams facing up, you take one edge and you fold it over twice towards you, and then stitch along that inner folded edge. Repeat for the other side so that the edges are finished and we don't have to worry about anything fraying. And the next step is a fun step. We're going to attach the skirt to the bodice. So what we're going to need is a nice long basting stitch all the way across the top of the skirt. Now what you don't see here is I took a moment to put on the bodice, making sure that the right side crossed on top of the left, and marked where I wanted that slit to be so I knew where to start and finish my skirt. On the left side of my body was the slit, so when I took off the bodice, I knew exactly where I wanted to start the skirt, then go all the way around and finish the skirt. Then I pinned it at the beginning and the end, making sure it was wrong side to wrong side, because once again, we're going to turn this into a French seam and sew it twice. Then I lined up my center back panel, one of the folded ones, with that notch that I had made with the center back of the bodice, which again, we put a notch on. I pinned those together, wrong side to wrong side, and did the same at the center front panel, which was my other folded panel, and in that center I made it match up with the center of the right side of the bodice that went on top. Then I lined up the center of my other two panels with the side seams. Now these ones were easier to find because it was two panels sewn together, so where those two panels were sewn together, which was a fold on the other panels, I lined that up with the side seam itself. Then I took a moment and took all the extra thread and gathered in between all of my pins so that the skirt ended up being the same length as the bodice that it was going to be sewn to. It was quite voluminous, but because it is a chiffon and such a lightweight fabric, we get a lot of movement without having too much bulk, which is what I personally prefer. And yes, this is time consuming to gather it all up, but it does make a nice difference in how it wears in the end. Then the skirt to the bodice. Now, take your time with this and make sure that everything you'd gathered is laying the right way so that the seam allowance is going up and the gathers themselves and all the skirt is going down. Every once in a while, you'll see that a gather wants to pop above that gathered line, that basted line. And we don't want that because that's not going to look right when we're done. So take your time and make sure to spread the fabric so you're stitching along that basting line. Again, sewing it together. But of course, this time we're stitching with a normal length, between a 2 and a 3 to attach the two together. Then, much like every other French seam we've done, we're going to trim all the seam allowance. There's only about 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance left. Now you can do a little more than that because this is quite a bulky seam. There's a lot of fabric here. Take your time and make sure you do not trim over that sewing line we just did. Then we're going to open up so you can see the whole dress and then fold again at that waistline so the fabric is good side to good side. So all of your other seams are on the outside and what we've just sewn is now trapped inside. We're going to sew that waist seam again at 1/4 of an inch or just bigger than the seam allowance that you left behind. And we're going to sew all the way around. Now this one's a little trickier because last time we had that basting thread that helped us keep all the gathers where we wanted them. So just take a quick moment with your hands, take a deep breath, and lay the fabric so that all the gathers are headed in the correct direction and all the fabric is laying nicely. Now if it's easier for you, you can run another basting stitch along this line and then gather that in and have that be easier, but I found it worked just as well to fold it over and use my hands to lay it nice and flat. And you stitch all the way from beginning to end. There was a small chunk on the bodice that needed to be finished as well, right when the crossover ended and when it went down to the waist. So all I did was, looking at the wrong side of the fabric, fold it over twice and stitch it down, much like we did the skirt. I checked the other side if it needed it too, but that crossover went straight into the skirt, so it was fine. And the last step is how we're actually going to hold everything closed. Now I took these extra pieces of the selvage that I used, that I cut off when I was making the bodice. And the selvage is great because it's not going to fray on you, so you can just use it as a tie and it matches. Otherwise, I recommend using some sort of ribbon. So here you can see me actually figuring out how to fold the bodice. I laid it flat and then folded the left side in and then the right side on top, so that I knew what needed to tie where. On that right side, I put a tie at the end of the waist. Here I am pinning it in. And then I put a tie on the outside of the waist on the left side, so it had something to tie into. I'm taking my time with this because this gets very tricky very fast. Then I put a tie on the very other side of that left crossover. just pinning it straight on. I pinned it underneath so it'd be nice and pretty. And then I opened it up and looked at the inside and pinned my last tie on the inside of the right side seam, as you can see here. At that point, all I did was sew all the ties down. Where I could, I sewed it directly to the seam allowance. Otherwise, I just made it nice and pretty as I could because I knew most of it was going to be covered by the actual vest and then by the harness on top of that. It's kind of like if you've ever worn a gi top in karate, they tie very similarly. A lot of kimonos do the same thing, or yukatas. It's that crossover and then just quickly tie idea. Then I put everything on, and honestly, I was very happy. The last thing to do was the hem of the skirt, but because we did such a swoosh and it is such a lightweight fabric, what you don't see here is that I put it on a hanger and hung it up for at least 24 hours, but ideally a week. This lets the hem kind of droop in different ways as much as it's going to before you want to sew it. Now, once it had sat for a week because I got busy with work, I just took a moment to put pins across it where I wanted the finished edge to be. So then you would just measure down from that pin 1/2 inch and cut along that line. Now, this is where I messed up because I definitely cut along the pinned line, which means my dress is just a little bit shorter than I wanted it to be. I did notice along the back it was a nice length, so I didn't worry too much about that. I only really took it up at the side, drooped the most. And I cut all the way along. I did the 1/2 inch because I was going to do a 1/4 inch fold and then a second 1/4 inch fold. You want to make, for something with a curve like this, the hem to be as small as possible because otherwise it gets very difficult to try and sew. It gets very clunky. That's why I like to stick with the 1/2 inch total. Once it was trimmed all the way around, it was time to sew it. To do the actual hem, you can see just a little bit here. I folded over that seam twice, a 1/4 inch, then another 1/4 inch. I trimmed the seam allowance, or the threads, right at the beginning, and I definitely back-tacked, and I just went all the way around. Now, I don't like to pin this because I find it doesn't stay nicely, and you can see that afterwards there's a bit of a wrinkle in what I've sewn. When you take it to the iron and give it a nice good ironing afterwards, that wrinkle goes away. But one of the reasons we want to keep this as small as possible, 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch, is to help and make that as smooth as possible. The thicker it is, the harder it's going to be that it wants to crinkle on you. And as you can see, I'm stitching along that inner edge as close to that inner edge as possible without going over it. And yeah, just sewing all the way around the hem. So all in all, I'm 95% happy, which is pretty high up for me. The one side keeps flipping back in, but I could in theory just add a little piece of tape. I want it to have a bit of realistic movement. I'm really happy with everything overall. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. As always, thank you to all my patrons. You guys make a huge difference to me. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye! Thanks for coming along on this journey with me, and if you enjoyed it, feel free to— oh no! Oh sh— oh, that's unhappy. Okay, well, we're gonna see if we can fix that after. Thank you so much. Why do I keep doing this? Outros are hard.